try to journal? I know I do. And it sometimes is difficult for me to stay consistent with it. I probably in my house have 20 different beautiful notebooks of different kinds that I've started. Sometimes I start and then like there'll be a page a year later. Is that something you do? It's definitely something I do. I cannot sometimes just get into the habit of it. I'll do it for a while. I'll have a jag with it, but I just sometimes can't get into the habit of it. Lately, meditation has taken priority over journaling. But after today's guest, Kathleen Adams, I'm feeling inspired, my friends. And if you want to feel inspired about getting into a journaling habit and what it can do for you to help you with a centered life thriving, then keep listening.
I know your deep, dark secret. You don't like your life. You're a woman in midlife, and for the past 2 decades or more, you've poured yourself in to other people. You've poured yourself into your career, your family, and yet on the inside, you feel broken. And that's no way to be. I'm Dr. Natalie Marr. I'm a clinical psychologist and a life transition expert. It wasn't too long ago that I was in your shoes, waking up in my early 40s, thinking I've got 2 failed marriages and I'm a single mom for the second time in my life. And I just knew that I could do better, that I could feel better. Fortunately for you, I have about 20 years experience clinically. And so I've created a method that will help you learn to love your story. I know that the story that you're telling yourself about your life feels awful. And I know that you think that you can't change that. I assure you, you can. And when we work together, I'm going to help you to craft a different story, a story that you love, a story that makes you want to get up every single day. Let's work together to help you love your story.
Are you on my mailing list yet? Because if you're not, you really should be. You want to join at learntoloveyourstory.com. If you scroll down, I'm giving away a freebie for you. Honestly, you know what it is? A free course. I sell online courses, but this is a course just for you. And it's about freeing yourself, letting go of what others' expectations and ideas are for you. You know, that nagging self-doubt in your head, it's usually fueled by your consideration of what others think of you over your consideration of what you think of you. And so I teach you in my video all about what is underlying that kind of self-doubt and how to get out of that conundrum. And I give you a workbook that goes with it that helps you to build the skill sets that you're going to need for that. So please make sure you're on my mailing list, because at the least, you're going to get a free gift. And at the most, you're going to hear about all the things that we're doing on Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving and LearnToLoveYourStory.com. And you don't want to be missing out on any of the new things that'll be coming your way.
Welcome back, everyone. It's so good to have you. We do have a guest today, and she is an amazing guest. Her name is Kathleen Adams. Kathleen is a psychotherapist and founder of the Center for Journal Therapy in Denver, Colorado. Her passion in life is teaching the healing art and science of journal writing. You know, I love that it's scientific, and she talks about research she has done in this area throughout the podcast today. She wants to make sure that all who desire self-directed change see journaling as the way to get that to happen in their lives. She's delighted to be with us today to share how writing a journal can move you toward healing, growth, and change in surprisingly easy and time-efficient ways. So let me introduce you to Kathleen Adams. Welcome back to Midlife Crisis to a Centered Life Thriving. Today's guest is Kathleen Adams, and she's going to share with us some wonderful wisdom on how journaling can help us with personal growth, can help us get from that midlife crisis feel in midlife to that midlife centered life thriving. So without further ado, welcome, Kathleen, to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Dr. Natalie. It's just a pleasure to be here.
you. So our first question for all of our guests is, tell us your story. Go all the way back to the beginning of time if you want to, or it could just be around this concept of journaling and why it became such a passion for you.
Thank you. Well, my own passion with journaling started very early in life. I didn't know about journaling at the time, but my older sister, who now has a doctorate in education, would come home from first grade when she was 6 and I was 3, and she would play school with me and teach me everything she learned that day. So I learned how to read and write, not very well, but I learned how to read quite well when I was 3, and loved reading, loved stories, knew from the time I was very small, probably 4, that I wanted to be a writer when I grew up, because I loved hearing stories and reading stories, and I wanted to offer stories to other people. So I think I started my first novel when I was 7, and it lasted about 4 pages, and then I ran out of plot. But anyway, when I was 10, my aunt gave me a little 5-year diary with the little lock and key that you could pick with a bobby pin. And I knew this because I'd been snooping in my sister's diary for a couple of years by then. Not because I cared about what she was doing. I cared that she was doing something. And it was important enough to write down. So I imagined that I would someday have a life that merited chronicle. And I did approach my 5-year diary with great enthusiasm, but it actually didn't turn out very well, because some days I didn't have anything to say, and some days I had lots to say and had to write in more than 1 year's worth of space.
Yeah.
So it just wasn't sometimes I wrote things that were really personal, and then I tore that page out, and then I didn't have it the next year. Anyway, I didn't have a really successful start, but I liked the idea of it. And pretty soon I graduated to spiral notebooks, and that was a lot more freeing. But from, fast forward a whole bunch of years, and when I was just kind of on the early side of midlife, when I was 34, I had a really very lucrative and enjoyable and growth process job as eventually editorial vice president of a small publishing company. Started out as editor, and we did business management newsletters and books for entrepreneurs and business owners who really didn't have any business experience. So it was worthwhile work. My boss was a Harvard MBA whose father had owned a Big O tire store in Missouri and always struggled with not knowing anything about business. So that was his mission, and it was a great mission, and we did it well. But I woke up one day knowing that this was not my life's work, and this was not what my soul wanted to be doing, and I wanted to do a different type of writing, and I had no idea what. So I rattled around for a while, and eventually some friends asked me if I would teach a little class on journal writing, and I said, just get a notebook. It's not hard. And they said, well, it's not hard for you. So I looked at my old journals and how I wrote in my journal, and I realized that I made a lot of use of different ways to write, different techniques, different not strategies. I called them techniques, many of which came from my journalistic background. I was an undergraduate major in journalism, and my creative writing from undergraduate school and earlier in life. So, for instance, unsent letters is a very common form of journal writing, where you write to cathart or to confess or to clarify for yourself. And that was one of the techniques that I thought would be useful for my friends to know about. It turned out in the early days there were 21 of those techniques. It has since kind of slimmed down to 18 because it was a very busy workshop. And and they sat on my living room floor and acted like I knew what I was doing. And I knew almost instantly that the intersection between writing and counseling was my life's work. I was a first semester graduate student in my counseling program at that point. In my wanderings since publishing, I had decided that I didn't know if therapy was my life's work, but I thought it might be, and might be part of it anyway. And, how could you go wrong with some psychology training? So, so it was very fast paced. I wasn't taking anything but basic classes in that first semester. And so I was terrified that people might cry or get in too deep and I wouldn't know what to do. So I kept it very lively, very peppy. And we had just an outstanding, experience with that first class. And I fell face first into it. I knew without any question whatsoever that my commitment was that I would follow this wherever it led me, no matter what it took. And that was 38 and a half years ago, and I'm still going strong.
That's amazing.
And it's just been such a wonderful, wonderful adventure through all of it. I am convinced that people who know the power of writing in their own lives are among the most informed and enlightened and self-aware and often happier and more peaceful with themselves when they can turn to writing as a way of exploration, of discovery, of engagement with their own needs, wants, pains, happiness, struggles, triumphs. The journal will hold it all. The first chapter in my first book, Journal to the Self, is called The 79-Cent Therapist. And that was written a long time ago. Now it would probably be a $2.79 therapist when you adjust for inflation, but that used to be the cost of a spiral notebook. And so that I don't think the journal replaces therapy by any means, but it can certainly, my work as a therapist has been to bring writing in a purposeful and intentional way into the client's therapeutic experience to the extent that the client is willing to do that. And, what I find and what other therapists have also advocated in a little survey that I used to give to therapists is that when people write a journal, the therapy often moves faster and is more coherent because there's 167 hours a week that our client isn't with us if we're seeing them weekly, and they can do their own extension work in the hours that they're not with me. So it is a real, for people who are willing to take it on. And there's ways to encourage people to take it on. I teach an entire class for therapists.
Definitely need to talk about encouraging people to take it on, because I also am one of these, I'm such a strong advocate for journaling as a therapist. And yet getting into that pattern for myself, I have fits and spells with it. Like I do it and then I stop, and then I do it and then I stop. So we definitely want to get into that today.
That's a very common story. You have a lot of company.
I want to go back because it's such a beautiful story that you came out of school ageness and into your career and reflected like, this isn't working for me. But what you went back to was from your childhood. Tell us a little bit about what pulled you back into the journal and then to see that as your passion.
I never left the journal. I have been writing a journal consistently from the time I was 10. And, with some false starts along the way, but consistently, really. Starting in high school, I was very consistent with it. And it has just always been a life tool for me. For a long time, I thought that I wrote a journal because I was a writer. And I didn't know that other people wrote journals also who didn't consider themselves writers. So that discovery came when I was 31, 3 years before I started teaching Journal to the Self, which in those days was called Write On with an exclamation point because it was the 80s. And the but when I was 31, I experienced a really the worst trauma of my life, actually, and was very rattled and shaken. And and there was a workshop that I had been registered for months in the tradition of Ira Progoff, who I consider to be the founder of journal therapy, even though he may not have identified himself as such. He was a psychoanalytic psychologist in Manhattan in the 50s and 60s and beyond. But in the 60s, in the 50s, he studied with Carl Jung at the Jung Institute in Zurich on 3 different postgraduate fellowships. And after his third one, he came back with this burning mission and vision to create a method of analytic interpretation that involved the therapist teaching the client how to kind of unpack their own subconscious mind and their own unconscious. And this, I'm imagining that the Manhattan, psychoanalytic community did not exactly take well to this rather radical approach in 1959 when he, announced his plan. But he did create what he called in those days a psychological notebook for his clients. And it was a journal, but it was very structured. It had a lot of processes that were designed to evoke unconscious material in a way that was safe and organic and in alignment with Jungian thought, which had a lot to do with, the collective unconscious, which Progoff interpreted as the underground stream where all of our images and archetypes live and emerge as we invite them forward. So it was really a beautiful methodology. And it was very, very shortly after this traumatic event. And I told my minister, it was at my church, I told my minister that I just thought I couldn't do this because I was just too raw. And he said, no, you need to do this. This is where you need to be. Yeah. So I reluctantly, but, eagerly also went, and it changed my life. It was so healing. It was so wonderfully cathartic. It was exactly what I needed. And it didn't resolve my trauma, but it certainly gave me tools to deal with it at a much more profound level than I might have. And I also, the other huge discovery was that in a room full of, in a church lobby full of 200 people, I did not see a single person that I recognized from the press club. I was an active journalist for years prior to that. I knew pretty much everybody in town. I didn't see a single person I knew. I thought, and so I walked around saying to people, why are you taking this class? And they said, because I want to learn the Progoff method. Why not? So that was my first awareness that other people wrote journals. So that was really kind of a turning point.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So after that, I dove into my Progoff journal face first, but it's a very complex method and it takes a lot of time. And the 30 days before I started graduate school, I took several of these same workshops with different instructors over the next several years because I just loved it. And I realized after a while that the reason I kept taking the workshop was because I never did the Progoff method unless I was in a workshop. I would keep it up for 2 or 3 weeks afterward, but it was just too complicated. So the month before I started graduate school, I decided to just devote 30 days to really working the journal as it should be worked. And it was wonderful preparation, but I was spending like 3 hours a day on it. And I thought, I get it. I realize why people don't do this. Why I don't do this anymore. It's because it takes too much time. And I remember having the thought, I wish there were a real journal method for real people who have real lives. And then, a few weeks later, I'm creating one.
It's not the same thing.
The artist's way is different, but also does that and dedicates a lot of time. And so people start it like with full start. They're going to do it. And then, a week into 3 pages every morning,
I loved my own morning pages when I was writing morning pages. I started writing morning pages because when the book came out in 1991 or something.
Yeah, it's been a while too.
Yeah, yeah. I started getting referrals for journal therapy assessments. By that time, I was in private practice. And I started getting requests for assessments for journal therapy because people were saying, my therapist colleagues were saying, my client's writing a journal, but she seems to be getting worse instead of better. What's up? And I'm like, I don't know. So what I discovered was that the people that were referred to me for just a quick check-in interpretation had discovered The Artist's Way and were writing morning pages. And when I kind of layered down to that with them, it's like, well, what happens and when are you doing, all that. I had read the book. I knew the method. I wasn't really practicing it myself. But the consistent story that I heard led me to the interpretation that when the first voice you hear in the morning is your own voice, and it is when the membrane between the conscious and the unconscious mind is the most permeable, if that voice happens to be the voice of your inner critic or your inner saboteur or your inner, whatever, introjection, it can lead to setting yourself up for a not very good experience of the day. So I started suggesting, well, what if you ate breakfast first? Or what if what if the instruction to write 3 pages first thing in the morning when you roll out of bed, pee, make your coffee, sit down, write, no excuses, no exceptions, which, Julia Cameron never meant it to be.
Right.
She's got a style, but that isn't, I don't think she ever intended that people would do this in a way that was harmful potentially for them. But, it's like write evening pages if you want to, or walk the dog first, or, take a shower. Mm-hmm. Get yourself positioned where you can write from a place of your cognitive behavioral strength, and then take it away. It's also quite a lot. 3 pages took me about 20 minutes, and I'm a really fast writer.
Because they're large.
Yeah.
It's not your standard notebook. It's not wide ruled or college ruled. It was even bigger the pages. So they took a while to.
Yeah. So it was, so anyway, that was, one of the places where permission is one of the huge aspects of therapeutic writing. Structure, pacing, containment, balance, and permission are my 5 guidelines for therapeutic writing. And, I have an entire model called the Journal Ladder that starts when I was working with trauma patients in a hospital setting. As a journal therapist, I heard, horrible stories of traumatic abuse and how people had been trying to work it through in the journal, but sometimes they would fall off the cliff and go into this very dark, deep place that they couldn't get out of. We kind of shorthanded it as falling into the pit or falling into the abyss. And again, they were writing without structure or pacing or containment and inadvertently re-traumatizing themselves in their writing because they're trying to work it through and it just came back in a flood. So by that time,
it just became a re-experiencing rather than
by that time, I had learned, I had created some other techniques that weren't in the original Journal to the Self workshop, just, out of 6 years of being a therapist in psych hospitals, and, doing journal groups. I created some new techniques that were appropriate for various therapeutic, experiences. And, And when I realized that structure, pacing, and containment were absent in free writing, which is what, I mean, even Morning Pages has a little bit of containment. It's 3 pages and then stop.
Yeah.
And the structure is write what's on your mind and do it first thing in the morning before you do anything else. So there was some, natural boundaries, even though they were pretty loose boundaries or wide boundaries. But so I took all my techniques and I ranked them in terms of what's the easiest, most accessible, fastest, results-oriented technique I know in all of my inventory of techniques. And it turns out that it was sentence stems. Right now I feel, today I want, the most important thing to do is,
It does, because it already formulates an idea or a schema of what you're going to start to talk about. Mm-hmm.
It is, in my experience with using both sentence stems and the corollary of questions, the most important thing to do is can be, what's the most important thing to do today or right now? Right now I feel can be, how do I feel? And one of the interpretations I had made over the years was that springboards, in a looser vernacular, I call these springboards, that start with a sentence stem tend to follow a narrative arc. They tend to be the story. Questions take us deeper and they become the query. Like what is the purpose of the story? So there's just like a little bit of a different cognitive experience with finishing a sentence versus asking yourself a question and then answering it. So we go with sentence stems as the very first rung on the journal ladder. And then 14 rungs later, well, 13 rungs, because there's 14 rungs in all, is free writing, which is where most people start in the absence of a different idea.
Right.
And so no wonder people have a hard time with journals. There's all kinds of things you can do with the journal that appeal to different cognitive states, different processing styles, different cognitive processing styles and emotional processing styles. So the lowest rungs of the ladder, 5 techniques, are concrete and observable and rational and data-based. So they really appeal. I mean, not only about
and developmentally, that makes sense.
Yes.
In our learning arc.
Yes.
You don't go to, grad school before preschool.
That's exactly right.
So you start with those concrete
That's
stages
exactly
in
right. And it
elementary.
also appeals to clients who are, or people who are rationally based, who are data-based, who are, scientists or engineers or left-brained people who like facts and figures and data. The middle rungs of the ladder move into creativity and insight, and they're a little bit more relational, and they appeal to people who like to be imaginative. There are some techniques where you're, using all of your senses to tell a story. It's called captured moments. And the upper rungs of the ladder are the abstract intuitive techniques. These are the ones, the Progoff dialogue technique exists in the upper rungs of the ladder. 2 of the 4 techniques in the upper rungs that ends with free writing are intentionally designed to invoke kind of an alternative reality. So the dialogue techniques, I mean, they require the capacity to suspend rational thought and move into, kind of what if, possibility thinking. So the dialogue technique is a conversation where you make up both parts. You ask your question and then you change chairs, like in the Gestalt technique. And if you're dialoguing with your midlife crisis, you say, hey, midlife crisis, when is this going to be over? And midlife crisis says, well, as soon as you accept the reality that this can be a really fertile time for you. And the next question is, oh, really? Are you kidding? Is that true? Oh, sure, it's true. I've been through this many times. I know the pattern. Oh, okay. Well, what do I do next? Well, it's like you're accessing your own inner wisdom. your own inner resources. And there's another one that requires a temporary suspension of, rational reality, which is perspectives, which involves jumping time, like 1 year from today, dating your page 1 year from today. On this date in 2025, where am I in the context of my midlife adjustment?
Yeah.
Menopause is finally over. I really
don't think that'll happen in a year for me. But definitely for the thought. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, it doesn't. It
But
goes
still,
on for a while.
it's a warranted.
Yes.
Because it patterns you towards your future self.
Yes,
Might
exactly.
embody other things that she can do that you can't do yet.
And
And you're anchoring into that in a way. You're
Absolutely.
asking that future wisdom to inform you today.
That's right. And you have identified some of the really primary characteristics, one of them being anchoring. When you can project your best possible self a year from now, you then have something to move toward, and you can work backward from that to say, well, if a year from now I'm going to be, healthier, happier, whatever that means to you, then what do I need to do now? I mean, like, how would I know I was getting there? What would be in place?
Yeah.
And so working backwards from the goal can help map a journey that may or, it's not about having sudden ESP and having the future reveal itself to you. It's about making something up. And if you like what you made up, seeing if you can make it happen. And the journal partners with you at every stage of the way.
And I like the idea of it being a container as well. Sometimes in midlife, everything feels like it has the same amount of importance, and we get into that anxiety overwhelm. And so having a space to put it, discuss it, dialogue around it, whatever, it is also a place to keep it. Like then I get to go into my life and do my life. And when I want to come back and revisit this and self-reflect more, I can, but it doesn't have to chase into my life and overwhelm me when I have a lot going on already.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. The journal can really help with overwhelm. It also serves the form of helping you sort. And sorting is, I think, really useful when you're feeling stressed. It's like, what's in the really what matters bucket and what's in the, this is a pain in the butt, but I have to do it bucket. And what fits in the I don't want to have anything to do with this bucket, and then you can identify what really matters to you and how you want to place your time and focus. And sometimes we can't avoid, not everybody has a job that they love. Not everybody has a family that's, self-reliant, or even gets along all the time. But you have to deal with those things anyway. But then you move into the coping strategies of, what are my resources? How do I activate my resources? And all of this is very, very available.
I would wonder, do you have any thoughts about how is journaling going to be the most helpful for women in midlife that are in that kind of stuck, not knowing what the next, they're still resisting that midlife could be their best life, for instance. So they're feeling kind of in that stuck place of being attached to the earlier adulthood for them. How is journaling going to help them?
There's a lot of self-soothing that can happen in the journal. There's a lot of nurturing. And when I'm working with people who are struggling with, any sort of adaptation to a changed reality, one of the first things we do is see if we can resource an inner ally that is maybe the wise self, maybe it's the energetic self, maybe it's the thriving self. It can be different things for different people. I had a client once who used her, stuffed animal from childhood that she still that had listened to all of her secrets when she was young, and she still had that stuffed animal, and that was the symbol, the thing that she chose as her inner ally. But when we find the inner ally, and there's a technique in the middle rungs, the insight-oriented and creative rungs, called character sketch, and that comes from my fiction writing history, where
I was going to say that sounds like a writing skill.
Yeah. So when we're writing fiction, we write character sketches of our characters so that we can, not so much to include in the writing, but just so we can understand them and understand their motivations and what drives them and how did they get to be this way and what do they want, what kind of shoes do they wear, what do they eat for breakfast, what's on their mixtape. And that dates me, doesn't it?
I love these 80s references. It's so amazing for me.
That ages me. But so the character sketch of the inner ally, so that it becomes a kind of more tangible. And then, there can be writing from the perspective of the inner ally. Or the inner ally can be consulted. You can have an entire board of directors internally. Whoever Taylor Swift can be on your board of directors if you're a Swiftie, and what would she say about this? She would say, girl, get up there and do it.
Yeah.
Shake it off. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the beginning of a relationship with the journal is one that can use some cultivation too, so that the stage is set for a trusting relationship. And one of the ways that I always encourage people to start out is with a note, a little, take the first page of any blank book or notebook, whatever, and just leave that very first page blank, turn the page, write maybe the title of the journal, if you have one, or at least the starting date. Turn the page again. On page 3, I invite people to write something like, this is my personal journal. Please don't read it without my permission. Thank you very much for respecting my privacy. And then another blank page, and then write, sometimes on the next page, I recommend saying, as I was saying, please don't read this. And this doesn't actually stop anyone from reading a journal that is bent on reading a journal, but it does stop people who accidentally picked it up going, I wonder what this is. Oh, it's Mom's journal. I better not read it. Well, or it's my wife's journal. Maybe a teenager would love to read their mom's journal. I don't know. But that's just the beginning of protecting privacy. That's the boundary that you set and take a stand for with yourself. Not necessarily for other people, but just with yourself. I have the right to my personal thoughts and feelings. Nobody can take them away from me.
It's a really good point.
Yeah.
It's almost like you're naming that for yourself and setting the boundary instead of like, have I set this boundary well enough that no one's actually going to get to this? It's just the naming, the action of doing that is healing. Yeah, that's a really good point.
So then privacy continues with taking responsibility for keeping it in a safe place. If you have a locking desk drawer or a filing cabinet, if you have a book bag that goes with you everywhere, if you keep a digital journal, that's fine too. That just password protected. By the way, there's no significant difference in outcomes, whether you write by hand or write on a device. I did a research study in 2015, I think, on as part of a 30-day digital journaling challenge that a colleague of mine, Nathan Oren, was hosting. And there were gigantic number of people who took this 30-day challenge, more than 1,000 all over the world.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it narrowed down to about 450, I think, that agreed to take the research part of it. Not all of them finished, so we didn't end up with that many. And we did a little bit of data mess up with, how we collected. Anyway, it had some challenges. It would not stand up under scholastic academic standards, but it was enough to get us going. And the reason I wanted to do the study with Nathan, with Nathan's agreement and participation, was because 1/3 of the people in this study were men, and that is like unheard of in the journal world. Most of the time, the ratio of men to women.
You can't ever get male clients to do that.
Well,
Ever.
Yeah, they respond. Men respond when men. I did an entire study with men back in the 90s. It resulted in a book called Mightier Than the Sword. The journal is a path to men's self-discovery that went out of print almost immediately. I didn't even have time to buy up my remainder copies because it was just like premature. But I had the best time with 300 men or 200 and some men who participated in this study with me. Anyway, once men get started, there is no discernible difference in how and what they write about as women, but getting started is more difficult for men, and part of it is they don't want to get really deep in the weeds. So the short, structured, concrete, data-based, information-driven prompts are a really great place to start. And and then they will easily move along into the more insight-oriented and intuitive techniques. Most of them will. I mean, some will just always stay there because that's where they want to be. But where was I going with this? Oh, the men, there were 1/3 of the participants were men, and it was an opportunity to really see how men responded to writing. So there were the biggest significant difference between men and women in this study. There was almost no difference in outcomes, whether you wrote digitally or by hand. Problem solving, insight orientation, clarity, focus, all of these things were approximately equal. The one place where it really, really differed was when I asked the question, how comfortable are you writing by hand? And a separate question, how comfortable are you writing digitally on a device? There was only a 2% difference in comfortable or very comfortable with digital writing. Men were 2 points higher than women on their comfort level with digital writing. Handwriting, 19-point difference.
Yeah.
Men, 19%. There was a 19% gap between how
so
comfortable
they didn't
women.
like it as much as women.
No, and they think that writing by hand is how you write a journal. So if you can,
so that's
if you can
part of
just
that
tell
holds
your
back.
men, if you can just tell your male clients, perfectly fine. If you want to get an app, you want to write on your phone, you want to write on your computer, doesn't matter. Do whatever floats your boat.
Wow.
Easy.
That's good to know.
And some of them still won't because they don't like, but then privacy comes in too. They don't want to be, they don't, and permission to rip it up and shred it if you want to.
No one says it has to stay in existence. That might be one of the ways you keep it safe. It still has done something for you. You can always go back and reread journals, which is another step. But the writing of it and the catharsis of just that process is a beautiful healing process in and of itself, even if you burn it the next day or erase it, delete the file.
Piggybacking on that, another very effective protocol, I suppose, that's kind of a harsh word for it, but standard maybe. Practice, recommendation that I always make is the reflection right, which I am convinced harvests insight faster and more readily than any other thing. I mean, it's not at all uncommon to have something insightful just fall out of your pen or out of your fingertips. But the reflection right, which is which happens at the end of a journal entry, reading it back and synthesizing what happened as I read this.
Yeah.
So the reflection starts out, as I read this, I realize, I'm interested in, I'm curious about. As I read this, I think, I feel, I want. As I read this, I'm surprised by. Any of those, just whatever organically happens, that is where, as I read this, I get it that I'm not going to be any younger than I am right now. And so if I'm procrastinating on something, this might be the time to start it.
Yeah.
Or as I read this, I realize that I really don't care as much about getting older as I used to. Or,
Yeah. I love that. So tell us, how do we make this a commitment? How do we make this a habit for ourselves? That'll be our little end piece of wisdom from you.
Thank you. Willingness to try, willingness to mix it up, to write different ways for different ways for different circumstances, trying a lot of different techniques and seeing what works. Where do you fit on the journal ladder? The journal ladder, I wrote this paper called The Journal Ladder that is mostly for therapists, but I think I would like to offer it to your audience because it just really kind of frames
Yes, thank you.
what we've been saying. Yeah. And I also have a little online class that's just, a self-paced 7-part class
Yeah.
called J is for Journal. And it just kind of talks about some of the basic ways to get started. And there's something like, I think, 68 different journal prompts in there in like a 15-page paper. So that's also something that I'd like to offer your folks. But
Yes,
how to make the commitment? Like any commitment, it grows roots with time. And like any worthwhile commitment, it enhances your life overall by reflecting, something about your core values and your capacity to, see the long game. So it doesn't have to be every day. It doesn't have to be more than, 5 minutes. There's a technique at the lower rungs called the 5-minute sprint, which is just, set your timer for 5 minutes and write. And when the timer stops, stop. Rings, stop. So there's an amazing amount that can happen in 5 minutes if you skip all the messing around at the first, the complaining, the whining. I can whine for a long time before
I can whine for way more than 5 minutes.
Yeah, really. But just 5 minutes, hit the page right, do a reflection, move on.
Got it.
So there's ways to make it not cumbersome. There's ways to make it fun. There's ways to make it purposeful. And I think anyone who has a sincere desire to explore, balance in the journal is really important too. If you are writing about really challenging or difficult or emotionally loaded things, balance it out with, what's the view from your window at sunrise? What is a moment of intimacy that you cherish that you had this week? Balance in the journal. A little bit of light will illuminate quite a bit of struggle and pain.
For certain it will. Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, by the way, for offering that free gift of the ladder to my listeners. Where can my listeners find you, your courses, that kind of thing? I'll make sure that the links are also in the notes today, but let us know, where can we find you?
My primary website is journaltherapy.com. And that is, sort of the hub of everything we do. So you can hear about other things. I also have a public-facing school called Journalversity on a learning platform, and that's under redevelopment right now. We're doing a little housekeeping and updating of the website and those kinds of things. But that's where J is for Journal will be hosted, and they can, see other offerings at Journalversity from there. And, I'm available. My email will be on your show notes, I'm sure, but it's KAY@journaltherapy.com. And I would love to hear from anyone who might. Oh, and we have certified instructors for the Journal to the Self workshop all over the world, really. So on Journal,
wonderful.
Yeah, on journaltherapy.com, there's a tab for, Journal to the Self. And in it, it has an international directory of people who are certified to teach the course. So that's a little fun 12-hour course that teaches you 18 different ways to use your journal.
There you go. Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, it's been just a
podcast.
pleasure. Yes,
it's been wonderful.
Good. Thank you so much, Dr. Natalie. It's been
You're
a pleasure
welcome.
to be with you.
You're welcome. Wasn't that just such a pleasant podcast? I enjoyed myself. I hope I didn't do a lot of talking in this podcast because, well, I was enamored, to be honest. I loved everything that she was saying. But I'm going to do a little practice that she shared with us, that reflection practice towards the end of the podcast. So as I reflect on this podcast, not a journal entry, the thing that I learned is that part of what gets in the way is our own preconceived notions of what journaling should or shouldn't be. And that when we, pull that out of our way, essentially, and just try things, and what works sticks and what doesn't work, throw it away. No judgment, staying compassionate towards ourselves as we're trying to build a commitment to this process. So it isn't that we're not good at journaling or that we just don't have the motivation to do it. I think sometimes it's the programming and conditioning in our lives of what it should look like that sort of gets in the way for us. So I want you to really think about what you learned from Kathleen Adams today. See if journaling is something that would be useful to you as you try to journey towards that centered life thriving. Because I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of Minnesota, I have to make sure at the end of each of these episodes that I give you the disclaimer that none of the material that I talk about in these podcasts is meant to replace kind of therapy or formal medical or mental health treatment. And in fact, anything that I offer on my website, my coaching programs, any kind of psychoeducational materials that I release are not a replacement for that level of care. So just take that into account when you listen. This is information for you, and hopefully you find it of value, both as an educational tool and for your entertainment. And I also want to mention that if anyone you know is in a mental health crisis, needs additional help, I always include these two crisis resources. They're available to anybody. Pick up the phone and dial 988 for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And you can always visit their website at suicidepreventionlifeline.org. Additionally, there's actually a crisis text line. So if you're not somebody that likes to pick up the phone, text HOME, home, to 741-741 to the crisis text line. And you can find them online at crisistextline.org. Thank you for listening to my podcast. And I hope that you like and follow me wherever you get your podcasts, and maybe consider leaving me a review. It always helps me to keep this podcast relevant when I know what you want to hear about.